South Africa is the largest economy on the African continent. Washed by two oceans, it is a country that was first visited in 1488 by the Portuguese, who for the first time crossed the Cape of Good Hope. But the Portuguese never established a permanent settlement there. The first attempt at occupation would only come 160 years later with the Dutch. And that leads us to a series of questions. Why, after all, did Portugal never colonize South Africa? Why did the Portuguese travel along its entire coastline and never establish a permanent settlement, unlike what they did in Angola or Mozambique? After all, wouldn't it be interesting to see South Africa, so rich in precious minerals, speaking Portuguese? But the answer to that involves history, geography, politics, and ways of thinking in the 16th century. Portugal. Was Portugal the first country to drive the great navigations? Still in the Middle Ages, the kingdom began its exploration around Africa and converted its most important military order. In a true navigation workshop with shipbuilders, cartographers, pilots, and captains, whose mission was to go a little further on the next voyage. Did the Portuguese go beyond the coast of Guinea in 1446? In 1482, did they reach Congo and Angola with the navigator Diogo Cao? And while Europe was experiencing the Renaissance, many Portuguese died and others were reborn, facing the terrible nature on the southern coast of Africa. In general, on the coasts of Namibia, the Cape wines are already beginning to show their power. Several vessels, both in the Age of Discovery and in the modern era, simply ran aground when approaching the Cape, with the ship being thrown onto the shore and everyone perishing in the desert on the coast of Namibia. A modern example is the German cargo ship Edward Borland from 1909. After a night of heavy fog, the captain ran aground on a sandbank during a trip to another city in Namibia, which at the time was controlled by the Germans. And the ship, after running aground, simply saw the sea recede, and it was never able to get out of that situation again. And the remains of the ship are 300 meters from the beach, trapped in the purest desert. In other words, what used to be a sandbank in the sea turned into 300 meters of distance from the beach. And in the same way, Portuguese ships fell victim on the coast of Namibia. We have the example of Bom Jesus, which disappeared in 1533 and was found on that country's coast in 2008. We have the example of Bom Jesus, gold coins of Moroccan, Venetian, Portuguese, and especially Spanish origin, with the vast majority being coins minted during the time of the Catholic monarchs. That, in addition to more than 300 elephant tusks probably traded on the coast of Guinea and other Portuguese possessions. The ship's cargo was incredibly well preserved by the sands of the Namibian desert, unlike its crew, who probably died and were not preserved by the Namibian desert, their destruction. But despite all the difficulties, in 1487, Dom João II organized an expedition to go even farther than Diogo Caos and appointed Bartolomeu Dias to command it. Bartolomeu sailed a lot, braved the winds, and, without fully realizing it at first, accomplished something no European had ever done before. He had sailed around the southern tip of Africa, and that dreadful place where the winds of two oceans meet and which seemed like the end of the world was named by him the Cape of Storms, due to the constant bad weather and the difficulty in rounding it. And back in Portugal, King Dom João II, in a spirit of publicity, soon decided to change the name of the cape. No one would want to put themselves on wooden ships to sail towards storms and death. So the king, being very shrewd, changed the name to something more promising, the Cape of Good Hope, the hope of wealth, the hope of spices, and the hope of better days. Days as good as becoming a member of our channel and getting access to our exclusive videos, for example. Bartolomeu didn't build a city at the Cape, nor did he leave any columns behind. He only left large and heavy padrões to be planted in the ground as a sign that people had already passed through there. The first one was left on the east coast of the Cape on March 12, 1488. And 10 years after that journey, the new king of Portugal, Dom Manuel, would prepare a new expedition with the purpose of reaching India. Would Vasco da Gama's fleet finally round the Cape of Good Hope? At Christmas, would he reach the easternmost coast, naming that region Natal? And did his crew write about the people they saw, their cattle, their villages, and their clothes? But, after all, why didn't the Portuguese get off their ships and colonize the Cape region? The thing is, they actually did get off. And one of the first to do this was Francisco de Almeida. After winning the epic Battle of Diu and practically establishing the Portuguese military presence in India and the Indian Ocean, Francisco de Almeida handed over the viceroyalty to Afonso de Albuquerque and returned to Portugal. When passing near the city of the Cape, he and his men decided to disembark to look for fresh water, as well as to resupply the ships. But they are soon met with hostility by members of the Khoi tribe. According to some sources, the Portuguese tried to steal cattle. According to others, they were robbed while trying to do business with the natives. The fact is that Almeida and his men returned to the ships and prepared to sack the village the next day. But when they arrive at the place, they are surprised by the Khoi appearing on the hills using tactics the Portuguese had never seen before. They used their own cattle as shields and threw spears with precision and at close range at the Portuguese. In this way, the troops panic and scatter toward the beach. And there, Almeida and his 64 men end up killed on South African beaches. The death of this renowned Portuguese captain had a psychological effect throughout the Kingdom of Portugal. Almeida was able to destroy hundreds of ships in the Indian Ocean, but he couldn't handle the natives on the beach. The Cape of Good Hope by itself was already mystical and ominous for the Portuguese. But now, the natives of the Cape were also starting to gain a reputation among them. The Cape had no cities for trade, no fruits, no gold mines or apparent precious metals. And the natives were still hostile and skilled in the art of war. The coastline was full of sharp rocks, dangerous for ships, and the weather was almost always violent. The Cape, therefore, proved to be a real nightmare. In this way, the Portuguese policy became to avoid having to land at the Cape at all costs. That's because the Portuguese castaways had terrible stories there. The coast was difficult to land on and even harder to survive. Unpredictable winds, powerful currents, hidden reefs, storms that came without warning and left nothing behind. In tragic maritime history, the famous case of the Nau São João is reported, which we have already covered here on the channel, and which sank near the current location of Port Edwards. With about 500 people on board, they landed more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest Portuguese settlement. And walking through the desert with little water, almost no food, and being attacked by tribes, after a series of wrong decisions, they ended up being enslaved and the captain completely lost his sanity. The same thing happened 2 years later, in 1554 with the shipwreck of the Nau São Bento. This ship, which was making the return trip to Portugal, was commanded by Fernão Álvares Cabral, son of Pedro Álvares Cabral, and sank with more than 300 survivors. However, after the long journey of thousands of kilometers north toward the nearest Portuguese camp, only 23 survived. And what's interesting in this regard is that Fernão Álvares, on the outbound trip to Goa, had transported none other than Luís Vaz de Camões on this same ship, São Bento. In other words, if Camões had returned with Fernão, he would have been one more of the shipwreck survivors in Mozambique. It's no wonder that Camões depicts the Cape in the Lusiads with the giant Adamastor, a mythological figure who would sink the ships that tried to cross it. And here's an interesting point. The Portuguese Empire was designed above all to look for large cities to trade with. The absence of them in Brazil, for example, made Portugal go 30 years without establishing itself permanently in the territory, only trying to do something when it realized that France was getting ahead. But in Africa, the Portuguese found large cities and complex kingdoms like the Kingdom of Congo and the Kingdom of Ndongo, which would later become Angola. The Portuguese discovered Kilwa and Sofala, where they established trading posts. And through these trading posts, they had access to already well-established networks, leading to the wealth of the interior, such as the slave, gold, and ivory markets. But at the Cape, there was nothing like that. It was a land without any appeal. Rocks, storms, hunger, and hostile natives were what awaited anyone who passed through the region. But even so, there was still the risk of shipwrecks, like those that claimed the São Bento and São João ships. Thus, since the Portuguese had territories on both the east and west sides of Africa, instead of settling in the area, they chose to observe the weather more closely each time in order to cross the Cape more efficiently. But all of that would change in the 17th century with the Dutch. In the midst of the Luso-Dutch War, the Batavians dreamed of taking the Portuguese possessions in Africa and Asia. But they didn't handle the Cape of Good Hope very well. During the exhausting voyages to Asia, it was common for the crews to suffer from scurvy. And so, the Dutch East India Company with business acumen saw the Cape as a good place to create a port where sailors could rest, ships could be repaired, and the sick could be cared for. The Dutch did not intend to create a large colony, but only a supply station. And to make this work, they began importing slaves from Asia and bringing in Dutch farmers, who would supply not only the fort, but also ships in dire condition. The hostile natives were not enslaved since the slaves were brought from Asia. And besides that, many generations had passed since those natives first made contact with the Portuguese. And so the Dutch managed to establish themselves in the Cape Colony. Interestingly, South Africa maintains good relations with Portugal, recognizing the achievements of that nation in navigating its main natural barrier. At the South African High Commission in London, images of Bartolomeu Dias are preserved. And at the William Cullen Library of the University of Johannesburg, there is a beautiful painting by John Henry Amschwitz, which depicts Dom Manuel giving Vasco da Gama the mission to cross the Cape and head to India. Thus, when we look at South Africa today with its thriving economy and wealth of precious metals, it's easy to imagine it as Portuguese and to idealize what that region would be like as part of the Portuguese-speaking community. But for a Portuguese person in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Cape was an almost mythological figure, a natural enemy, a barrier of rocks and winds that prevented men from reaching their goal in the Indian Ocean. There, technological superiority was overcome by the relentless force of nature. And this fits with the 16th century thinking that if you could dry up the sea between Portugal and India, you would see its bottom paved with the bones of Portuguese navigators. And you? Did you ever wonder why the Portuguese never colonized South Africa? What surprised you the most? So go ahead and leave your comment now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. This way, you'll have access to exclusive content so you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.